So food and ag doesn't have to be a net emitter. It can actually be a net sequester because of that power of soil to store carbon. And just to put in perspective, there is 3 times more carbon in the top 1 meter of soil than there is in all the atmosphere. And there's 5 times more carbon in that same top 1 meter than every single plant and tree on the surface of the earth. And so you think of all these, plant a tree programs, which is great, don't get me wrong, but the amount of soil or amount of carbon stored in the soil is way more than can ever be stored in. We could cover the entire earth with trees and there'd still be way more carbon stored in the soil.
Well, welcome to this week's Leaders on a Mission. I'm your host, Simon Leach, and look, today I'm joined by Lars Dyrud, CEO of EarthOptics. EarthOptics are a company using cutting-edge tech to really bring about and unlock the power of soil in the fight against climate change. So I'm really fascinated with this discussion because Lars has got a really interesting background, and we're going to kind of background in space science, and I think Lars brings a really unique perspective to the future of sustainable agriculture. So we're going to dive into the role of soil in carbon sequestration, the challenges of measurement, and how EarthOptics is really reshaping how we kind of value what's beneath our feet. So Lars, it's a real kind of pleasure to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for your time, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Simon.
Awesome. I mean, maybe we'll just take it back a little bit, right? This background of yours in kind of space science, working with NASA and Johns Hopkins, and then now into kind of these earth sciences, as it were. So what brought you into this space in the first place, as it were? Yeah, it wasn't the most conventional kind of route, as it were.
No, certainly not. I'm a space physicist by training, now working in soil. And my wife teases me that I literally can't get any lower in my career. I think she means altitude-wise, but I can't guarantee that. I kind of spent the first half of my career as a basic researcher, mostly in space science. And then I got drawn into earth science some years ago when Obama was elected. He wanted to move more of the NASA science budget away from pure space exploration. And to kind of refocus on Earth. So that meant instead of satellites looking out, some more satellites looking down. And I was working at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab at the time. And we were almost exclusively focused on planetary exploration missions, which the lab had been doing for decades. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab is about a 1,000-person space department. Working since the days of Voyager. They built one of the first instruments that went on the Voyager spacecraft. And so they had a long history in building instruments and managing planetary exploration missions, but almost zero work in earth science. And so I kind of volunteered to lead up the lab's kind of foray into earth science activities. And as a result, had the really good fortune of leading mission team proposals, which putting together a NASA science mission proposal is pretty extensive activity. It usually costs like $1 million just to put a proposal together, and involves about 40 or so scientists and engineers getting together for about 30 days to work out all the details of everything you want to do. So it was a really awesome experience for a pretty young researcher at the time to be able to lead those groups. And one of the missions we worked on was putting really sensitive radiation detectors on, back then it was the Iridium satellites, because they were launching about 78 satellites. Never before did we have an opportunity to kind of encompass the globe as sensors. And so we entered on a really great activity over the course of a couple of years, trying to ask and answer questions like, well, if we could put a bunch of earth science sensors on 70 plus satellites, what would we put on there and what would we be trying to measure? And so measuring Earth's radiation budget for actually measuring climate change, and measuring Earth's global carbon cycle, particularly around terrestrial carbon production, growth of plants, were two of the big problems that we'd actually never tackled before as a human society. And so I learned a fantastic amount about measuring climate change from a lot of that effort, and then was fascinated by how little we were actually measuring some of these incredibly important parameters, like how much radiation is actually leaving the earth. We actually do a really good job measuring how much radiation comes in from the sun. Not that great of a job actually measuring how much goes out, because it's kind of hard. You need a lot of sensors encircling the globe constantly. And I was also fascinated by just how poorly we were measuring the terrestrial biosphere. And so looking at some of like the standard carbon cycle charts from the IPCC at the time. And so I was a novice earth scientist at this time and a space physicist focusing on things outside of the earth, not things on the earth. So I remember asking some of the scientists, like, all right, let me get this straight. So humans are burning about 18 billion tons of CO2 every year in the form of fossil fuels, but the atmospheric CO2 only goes up by about 9 billion tons. And this is literally the question I was asking, like, where does the rest go? Like, well, that's really easy. It goes in the terrestrial, about half goes in the terrestrial biosphere, the other half goes in the ocean biosphere. It's like, yeah, but like, where does it go? Like, all right, well, the ocean's pretty straightforward. Phytoplankton are made out of carbon. When they die, they float to the bottom of the ocean. They just stay there forever. Like, okay, what about the terrestrial biosphere? Because like I had heard we were like burning down the Amazon rainforest like continuously. And like, how is it that the terrestrial biosphere has more carbon in it every year? And so sure enough, the best, scientific estimates have been and were then at that time that the terrestrial biosphere is adding about 4 to 5 billion tons of new carbon every single year. And so they say like, well, plants are made out of carbon. When they grow, that takes carbon out of the atmosphere. And then when microbes consume the organic material, that releases CO2 back in. And there's a net more going into the terrestrial biosphere each year than what's coming out. I was like, all right, yeah, but like, where is it? Given that whole Amazon burning thing, like, where is the new carbon going? And their answer was like, we actually really don't know. And that still is mostly true today. We really don't know where the new net carbon goes. We know pretty well that there's about 4 or 5 billion tons going into the terrestrial biosphere each year, every single year. So like this is like every single year the terrestrial biosphere is holding 4 to 5 billion more tons of carbon than it was the year before. And so it's fantastically interesting that nature's keeping up with about half of human emissions. Would be great for it to keep up with 100%. And that's really where I started thinking about like, well, if we understood where and how the net increases of carbon storage were happening on the earth, maybe we could do something about it. And this was like 15 years ago. But just, getting really interested in our lack of ability to truly measure some things that I thought were like incredibly important, like how much actually new net energy is being retained in the earth each year, or how much, new net carbon and where is it going in the terrestrial biosphere each year. Those to me felt like something that we shouldn't just be estimating, but we should be like knowing very precisely. Then fast forward to today, where so I had had that kind of like very curious couple of years working in earth science, and then I don't know, somewhere about 13 years ago, I caught the entrepreneurship bug, where I just felt I could make more progress more quickly on pursuing fun, interesting things to work on through that route, and I've been stuck ever since. And so
when stuck with the bug, you've been stuck with the bug, right?
Yeah. Indeed. It's been true. I've had the awesome privilege of getting to work on just really fun, interesting topics across the board with the technology startups that I founded and have been working on for that period. And so fast forward to today with EarthOptics, where we were working on technologies to measure soil, and in the early days, really with a just focus on agronomy. And then, I started hearing more and more about soil carbon, that there are credits that people are paying for. Like, let's take a look at this and see if our technology that we were building would be useful for measuring carbon. And sure enough, it was. We're developing technology to measure soil variability using sensors, and we use machine learning to take the results of a soil sample, but then use that as a training data set to make very high resolution maps of soil properties. And one of the things that it works really well on is soil carbon. So that really got the company into the kind of soil carbon space. But for me, it was personally satisfying because I was now able to contribute to some of that, like the questions I had 15 years ago, like why don't we know where the excess carbon is actually going? And so, yeah, it's a little bit of a, kind of full circle from a curious young space scientist learning about earth science to being able to, make some concrete contributions, not just for farmers and ranchers and helping them, get paid for the great work they're doing on behalf of the environment, but also to contribute to just the general knowledge of where some of this carbon is going and what are the processes that are involved in it. And a couple of years ago, it really hit home for me because I was listening to a talk from one of our investors, S2G, and he pointed out that there was a Nature paper that just come out this a couple of years ago that is estimated that humans are now like operating on 51% of the terrestrial biosphere. And so like Mike was like, hey, we're now the majority shareholders. We need to take responsibility and control over what it is we're actually operating on. And so like it's good to know that there's about 49% that we're not mucking around in. But in terms of our managed forests, cropland, and grassland, that's a little over half the terrestrial biosphere that we control. So to me, it seems like we have a high degree of responsibility for understanding what we're doing to it and whether we're making things worse or better in that process. And
Got it.
And to be honest with you, we have a lot to learn still in that regard.
Yeah. Tell me, what do we know now that we didn't know 15 years ago then when it relates to kind of the measurement and the importance of the soil and the carbon within it, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, we're now, because of soil carbon programs, it's not just scientists who are trying to make estimates. There's actually, there's a lot more private dollars because of the voluntary credit systems, in some case regulatory. We are measuring soil carbon way and much larger areas and way more frequently than we ever have before. The only estimates we had on soil carbon 15 years ago were those conducted by scientists. And now the sheer volume of acreage that measurements are happening on now, it's tens of thousands of times greater. And so we're just getting way more measurements, which, always equals a better understanding of what's going on. I think we also have a much better understanding of what type of land management practices are leading to carbon evaporation from the soil, and what kind of practices and technologies are leading to increased storage as well.
Got it. Okay.
Because of all that extra data.
So what is when you think about then, like the end game, for instance, when you think about something like EarthOptics, so just outline the kind of problems that you solve, and I suppose, the kind of impact this kind of technology can have.
Yeah, and for us, the technology is really a means to an end. Like our whole goal is, we think soil data is incredibly important and valuable for both farmers and ranchers to help them make business decisions. In terms of simple things like maximizing their profitability, reducing chemicals and pesticides where appropriate because they don't need them. For example, reducing soil disturbance because the soil is not actually compacted in certain areas. And so we just think better data, better decisions. And so our whole focus is, how can we help farmers and ranchers through data drive improved profitability in their operations, while allowing them and other stakeholders to achieve their sustainability goals. And we think really data and information is the key to doing that, and that's why folks work with us. But that's the mission that drives us is improving working land profitability while achieving sustainability goals.
Yeah, got it. What do people say? I think agriculture is one of the, when it comes to digitalization, I know we've heard lots about it over the years, but it's probably been the sector that has been undigitalized, right? Compared to others, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, there's been great progress made going back to the 90s, but there's still a tremendously long way to go. And really taking advantage of the incredible information. And there's just new technologies coming in line every day. And so, for example, EarthOptics measures soil biology by doing DNA measurements of soil tests, and that's just not something that was feasible even 10 years ago from a cost standpoint. But the cost of DNA testing have come down so dramatically, and continue to do so, that we can now incorporate that in as a standard practice, and really start unlocking the mysteries of soil biology to help drive that decision making that we're looking to improve.
Yeah, got it. So you mentioned around when it comes to reducing the use of kind of chemicals, as it were. What else can you do? Because you hear a lot about yield, and you hear a lot about the challenges with the soil, right? In terms of the fertility of it, as it were. So, what can a farmer do or how can you help a farmer unlock the performance of their soil, as it were? Yeah,
and for us, we really kind of view it as optimizing soil health, and so there's a tremendous number of acres throughout the world that the soil really is not at optimal health. And it's just like people too. Like most, I'll put it on Americans, but a lot of Americans are not at optimal health, and so there's things that can be done to become more optimal. But those things are going to be different for every single individual. And soil is very similar. Soil is so incredibly variable. And you go just 5 feet away, and the microbiome of that location is going to be, in some cases, completely different of of what it was, and just 5 feet away. You go 100 feet away, you might have completely different physical substructure of the soil in terms of how much sand, silt, or clay percentages there are in that area versus another, not just 100 feet away. And so recognizing that just incredible variability, both physically, chemically, and biologically, optimizing soil health is really, has been historically a pretty challenging endeavor. And then without soil DNA, it's almost impossible to do. And so we're really excited about just kind of how these new technologies are helping us step one, understand how to measure soil health, but then how to translate that understanding of soil health into ability to optimize it. And from the human health analogy, the way a lot of soil is managed today is it'd be like if you went to the doctor and the doctor didn't run any tests, but just started handing out prescriptions to you in terms of like, here's some products that you ought to take that make people healthier. And the truth is, many of them might not be necessary or helpful for you, but they help some people. So, the doctor just gives you just about everything. In many ways, that's the way a lot of soil is managed today, where we don't have a high degree of insight into it, but farmers and ranchers are being sold and pitched, biological products and other pesticides that they believe ought to help in certain circumstances. And so with better data, you can just make much better decisions, just like, thankfully our doctors do today. They don't give us prescriptions without running a whole battery of tests first to really understand what we might benefit from. And so that's kind of the shift in mindset through data we're trying to, make available to farmers and ranchers. Like, hey, let's really understand where your soil is health-wise, and then truly understand what kind of products and or management practices are going to bring it from its current state to its optimal state. And the good news is for farmers and ranchers, there's a lot of new profitability to be had in optimizing soil health. And in many cases, as much as 50, 70 or more dollars of profit per acre through more efficient use of fertilizers, better use of soil biologicals, which are a brand new industry that has grown up over the last decade or so, that just are showing a tremendous amount of benefit for improving soil health in a kind of targeted fashion. But again, without a measurement on the existing state of soil biology, it's really hard to understand which soil biological products ought to be used on that particular acre or farm.
That sounds so encouraging, because all I hear about is the challenge of the farmer in terms of the profitability challenges and being literally squeezed and under pressure. And for you to say like 50 to 70% opportunity, it's incredible. Have they started to see it at this point? What's the kind of commercialization path forward for that?
I mean, so EarthOptics, because we're focused exclusively on soil data, we serve both sustainability organizations, so in many cases, food companies, grocers, CPGs, and other large agriculture, international agriculture firms that have a sustainability interest in the ingredients that they're sourcing. But then we also work directly with farmers and ranchers. And so our whole goal is, let's measure everything anyone would ever want to know about this soil and be able to provide this data to make, to improve decision-making for all the stakeholders, whether it's someone who cares about soil carbon, like a grocer or a CPG, or, the farmer who's responsible for farming that field. And so we really work with kind of both ends of the spectrum. But we don't think, the food companies and carbon project developers, none of them are going to achieve their sustainability goals if the farmer and ranchers aren't achieving their profitability goals. It's just never going to happen, and nothing's going to get off the ground. Now, good news is most improvements to soil health that are, wonderful for carbon retention in the soil are also the same improvements that drive increased farm profitability as well. So it's actually, these things are not opposed to each other at all. They're almost always in line with one another.
Yeah, tell me, have you seen that come together a lot more? Like, we're talking here about the value chain coming together here, right? So the CPGs working with the farmer on broader sustainability kind of initiatives, and you're talking about bringing both sides here together, right? Which sounds very powerful. Is this relatively new in terms of that kind of discussion?
I think quite new, but I think we'll continue to see acceleration. There's there's a number of voluntary offset carbon credit programs that have been around for about 5 or 6 years around soil. But I think what we're really starting to see increased awareness from food companies, from grocers on hey, soil plays a massive role in climate change. And as requirements increase for companies accounting for their own emissions, and those of their supply chain. And, so for every single food company and grocer, the farms and ranches, they're a part of their supply chain. So there's increased kind of like demand and scrutiny around supply chain emissions. And that's only growing. EU and, California and a number of other areas have now kind of put forth regulations. Most of them come live around 2028 or so that like, hey, big companies, you actually have to account for the emissions in the supply chain, and you really ought to be working to reduce those emissions. And so, like I said, for the agricultural companies, food companies, and grocers, that means farms and ranches. And so we are seeing, it's still fairly early days. We're seeing a lot more interest and funding towards these programs were like, hey, let's step one, measure what's going on in our supply chain. And step two, are there interventions that we can help participate in, or in some cases help fund, that will increase soil, carbon storage and reduce emissions on farm and on ranch? And of course, the answer is yes. And the nice thing about soil, carbon storage and soil is food and agriculture is the only industry that can actually sequester carbon. Every single other industry, the best they can do is try to reduce their emissions. But with food and ag, we got this awesome opportunity where we can actually sequester new net carbon as a byproduct of how we produce the products that we are. And so it's an awesome position to be in. I think in food and ag, because there's so much impact that we can have because of that sequestration potential.
Yeah, no, I love it. Just on that, because you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion when you were trying to measure on an annual basis, I think it was 4 billion kind of tons of CO2 go to the soil, as it were, but you weren't sure exactly where. Is it the plan to, with this technology and, to be able to kind of really improve that? Like in terms of that overall kind of number, is that one of the goals, as it were?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, and step one is food and agriculture are still net emitters. So in the U.S., food and agriculture are responsible for about 10% of emissions. Globally, it's more like 35%. So food and ag doesn't have to be a net emitter. It can actually be a net sequester because of that power of soil to store carbon. And just to put in perspective, there is 3 times more carbon in the top 1 meter of soil than there is in all the atmosphere. And there's 5 times more carbon in that same top 1 meter than every single plant and tree on the surface of the earth. And so you think of all these, plant to tree programs, which is great, don't get me wrong, but the amount of soil or amount of carbon stored in the soil is way more than can ever be stored in. We could cover the entire earth with trees and there'd still be way more carbon stored in the soil. And so really managing carbon in the atmosphere is almost exclusively a process of managing carbon in the soil. And so the atmosphere and the soil are the kind of 2 primary sinks where carbon cycles between. And they do so, it's mediated by the growth of plants and microbes, consuming organic matter. And so understanding that cycle and process and how it operates on every acre where plants are growing is really necessary for understanding how can human involvement make that situation better as opposed to make it worse. And so unfortunately today on many acres that we manage, we're making it worse, but there's, a whole lot more that we're actually making it better by measurement, by understanding which practices, which products that we can apply to our soil that actually help sequester new net carbon.
Yeah, I see a lot of that data, high level data, which might say agriculture is responsible for 10% of all emissions, etc. Is that a net figure normally that is kind of put out there?
It's considered a net figure. It's a net figure, and undeniably they're all estimates, right? We don't have perfect measurements on any of this stuff, and particularly the soil. So it is a little interesting that we know with a pretty decent amount of certainty that that 4 or 5 billion tons of new net storage every year. But like I said, we don't know where it's going. We do have measurements. We know some farms and ranches are losing soil carbon, and some naturally untouched areas are losing and gaining for various reasons. But we actually don't have a very good accounting on where that's actually happening. So the actual amount of emissions net sequestration that food and ag are responsible for are just kind of best guess estimates. given the models and whatnot that scientists work with. But
Yeah.
that number could be a lot different in reality, and we really need measurements to prove whether that's the case or not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I just hear like over the years, like farmers using fertilizer to try and increase obviously the yield of the health of their soil, but it just being this law of diminishing returns ultimately, right? And it just sounds like there's a whole new paradigm here, and a whole new kind of opportunity out there. It sounds very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think with the focus on soil health and using measurement to tell us what healthy looks like, we think is really the way to increase farm profitability, increase soil carbon storage, reduce the amount of cost for inputs that farmers have to invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, what about it's funny with ag tech, isn't it? Right? You hear about this really interesting kind of technology, and how is the farmer adapting to to this type of a tech? What are the challenges, I suppose, with having the farmer have this data in their hands and then being able to kind of make kind of informed decisions with it? Is it a really steep learning curve?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have software that can make this a lot easier, where we make it even so easy where you can press like optimize and we'll tell you which seed and products that are likely to perform, and help you achieve your goals in this particular field. But I think the bigger challenge is not necessarily the learning curve around the technology or the data. It's changing practice, right? We all have our habits, and most farmers, rightfully so, in an entire career have like 40 experiments that they get to run. Right. And so they are very rightfully cautious and conservative around making any significant changes, because you don't have a lot of chances to screw up and make up for it. And so, that's completely understandable, but that always means that I think agriculture will be a somewhat conservative industry when it comes to adopting new practices and new ways of doing things. And so it always takes time, and should, to be honest with you, because, farmers shouldn't be making trying crazy new things every single year necessarily. You don't have to come back from a mistake.
Yeah, I understand. So so tell me, like, where have you? So the company had been around for about 5 years, right?
Yep, nearly 6, but we've been in market for around 5.
Yeah, I think you were born out of the COVID times. You probably founded around COVID time. Right?
Yeah, just a little bit before it. In our very early days, I had to. I drove myself personally to we only had one customer at the time. It was Case New Holland, and we were doing some demonstration on some fields in Illinois, right during COVID. So I drove personally out with all our equipment and did the work on the farm. It was probably around March or so, right in the height of that COVID time. So we'd been around a little bit before that, but only long enough to have one customer. But it was clear, like, hey, like, the crops don't really care about COVID. They're getting planted, and we have to make our measurements before the crops are planted. And like, we need to show this data to our one customer to get them to continue to be a customer. It's like, it's going to have to happen. It doesn't matter what, this was back when everybody was kind of sitting at home watching, whatever, that Tiger Joe show or whatever it was. Like, there's a whole bunch of TV shows that everyone was collectively watching the same. And so during that time I had to, hop in the car, and it was a fascinating trip, to be honest with you, where the highways were just dead. I remember driving through Cleveland at like rush hour on a Tuesday, and it was just me. Like, I didn't encounter another vehicle for like half the trip through the city, and it was nuts. And so it was pretty interesting experience, but also a great reminder of who I did see out on those, on the roads from the highways, were the farmers working and truckers bringing all the food and other necessities for everybody else. So it was a pretty powerful, experience to be able to see, like, yeah, there's still a lot of people that are keeping us all moving, and they don't get to take a break.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you, when you think about kind of milestones for the company, in that time, how do you kind of reflect on some of the kind of key milestones?
Yeah, certainly at that COVID time, staying alive as a company, that was that was probably the most important single milestone. The others are getting on more acres, and so I think we're about to announce that we've been on 4 million acres, and I know we made an announcement about 1 million acres about a year and a half ago. But when we first just got started, I know that in our first year in market, we were on 20,000, and we were pretty excited about that with our very first contract. And all the data was collected by myself and other early employees of the company, most of which are still here. So that was pretty fun.
So 4 million acres. That sounds like a pretty large amount. What is the target market of acreage that you could kind of
a lot bigger than four. In the U.S. alone, there's about 200 million row crop acres.
Yeah.
And there's about 800 million acres of grasslands in the U.S., but about 400 million of which are like actively grazed by ranchers. So yeah, we got plenty of room to continue to grow in the U.S. alone. We operate in Brazil as well, that has similar quantities of farm and ranch acres as the U.S. does, and even larger in some cases. So just those two markets alone represent nearly half of U.S. or global production. So we have plenty of room to grow, without doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are in acreage, what does it involve? Like, what kind of hardware, software are the kind of requirements that kind of go down, as it were?
Yeah. So one of our technicians or one of our partners or dealers. So we essentially digitally twin the soil. So we're making physical, chemical, and biological measurements through DNA of the soil. And so that's a process of, we send a technician out, they've got sensors on an ATV, and they drive back and forth and map out the whole field, but then stop and collect soil samples every so often. Those samples go back to the lab for testing for biology and chemistry. And then while they're collecting a sample, we've got a sensor that actively measures soil compaction and soil bulk density to get the physical parameters of the soil. And then all that, the results of those soil tests back in the lab get combined with the sensor data, and we get these really high resolution maps of all those physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil. So it's relatively straightforward process, but one that's at least a little bit different than not much had changed in soil testing in the last 50, 60 years. It was take soil samples, send them to a lab. You now have a lot of information, but just about the locations in which you tested it, which, as I talked before about how variable soil is often not good enough to really do what you want to do when it comes to decision making. And like I said, there was zero biological information on soil. And so the attribute that might be the most important to crop productivity and sustainability was something that we were completely blind to until just a few years ago when we introduced this, DNA testing for soil.
Got it. Yeah. And that was probably related to the the kind of merger with Patent Ag as well, right? Because that's what their specialty was, right?
Yep, no, that's exactly it. So yeah, that was one of their big motivators for us to see this as a really beneficial merger for a long list of reasons. But adding soil biology, we knew was something that we needed to be able to do, because that's carbon dynamics in soil are biologically driven, right? Like that's how carbon dioxide gets released in the atmosphere from soil, is by having microbes consume it. And so much of carbon retention in the soil is due to fungal growth from things like mycorrhizal fungi and things like that. So without measuring the biology, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen carbon-wise in the soil, but it's also critical for crop performance as well.
Yeah, so you've so it sounds like that was a really important kind of juncture with EarthOptics and Patent coming together, as it were. And how has the integration kind of gone? And I suppose what were the real kind of challenges with integration?
Yeah, I mean, the integration's gone, to be honest with you, spectacularly. Like, I've bought and sold a handful of technology companies, startup technology companies before. So I joke, I've got, one of my last jobs, I sold my company to a company that's owned by Vista Private Equity, with the larger private equity companies in the U.S. And there's a company called EagleView that did largest aerial imagery provider in North America. And I was running R&D, and my CEO at the time was like, "Hey, would you be interested in running corporate development?" He's like, "How much experience do you have with acquisitions?" I was like, "Well, I bought a company and I sold the company, so I probably have a lot more experience than most, but surely a lot less than some." And so that remains true today, where I've bought and sold a handful of companies, so I got a little bit of experience under my belt. But running corporate development at a PE firm for a year and a half gave me a high degree of exposure to the processes associated with how to evaluate acquisitions, etc. And so never before in my limited experience, nonetheless, usually when you want to look at a deal, like you get really, there's a honeymoon phase. You get super excited about it. It's all positive. It's only good. But then as you start doing more diligence, you dig in more, things always get a little less good than when you first looked at it. This was the only deal I've ever experienced. Like, man, the more the both parties dug in, it got better. Like we'd uncovered more synergies, both on cost and on revenue, but across the team too. So just really great synergies across the leadership team. So we were able to build a much stronger leadership team than I think either company had, just because we had, each company had some strengths, and in many cases were right in the areas where the other company had some weaknesses. And so we knew that ahead of time that we're going to have this great leadership synergy, that the teams got along together incredibly well. And so, I mean, we predicted it would go really well, because when you have that kind of leadership, when the leadership teams get along really well, then you can expect it to go, I think, reasonably well. When that's not the case, then yeah, good luck. You may or may not have a successful integration. So we were super fortunate. We did know that ahead of time, but luckily it came out as predicted, where it's been just really excellent integration. I would say really the only significant challenges are on just that typical pain in the ass stuff, like back office integrations around sales systems and HR systems and accounting systems. That it's always a pain in the butt. There's no way, unless magically both companies were using the exact same system and had them configured in the exact same way, which never happens. That, to be honest with you, those were the biggest kind of like stumbling blocks or thorns, I think, over the last few months.
I think you'll take that, right? I mean, you said you lucked out with the broader kind of merger, right, in terms of the teams and how they came together and complemented each other, which is amazing. You would have taken that all day long, right? So a little bit of back office integration, it's all doable, isn't it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. And so you have about 100, am I right? It's about 150 people in the company in total, something along those lines.
A little bit less now. That's how much we had at probably time of merger, and there were a number of synergies throughout the company. So we're probably more like 120 currently.
Got it. Okay. And I mean, it just strikes me, it's the companies these days across this broader climate space, you need so much expertise in terms of technical kind of brilliance and expertise, right? Looking at the domains, that must be the case with you guys, right? So, in terms of I suppose the question is, just give me an outline, I suppose, of the different types of technical breadths and depths you have within the organization, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of PhDs and a lot of highly, trained and, skilled non-PhDs, all the way from, folks technicians that go collect data in the field, many of whom have bachelor's degrees and, some relevant field like agriculture or biological or ecosystems, we have a number of PhD agronomists that work at the company that are understand how soil works. We've got PhD computational biologists working on the DNA side. So we must have 8 or 9 PhDs working in the company, and just an incredibly broad range of fields, including space scientists. Although I don't do anything useful, but our chief data scientist is also a space physicist. He and I go way back. So yeah, it's a pretty incredible breadth of different skill sets that are coming together just on the technical side. Of course, we've got an awesome software team that's, building great cloud-based products at massive scale. Like things like our DNA database, for example, is the largest DNA database in the world. And just the sheer volume of data that we're collecting on soil, and having to do so very cost effectively, because per acre soil is not nearly as valuable as a whole bunch of other things. But the amount of data we collect is incredible. And so just being able to manage that cost effectively and turn it into useful information is a pretty significant data science and software enterprise.
Yeah, amazing. How do you manage that? When you think about the unit of measurement with that soil, I mean, how big is it?
What do you mean the unit of measurement?
Yeah, like when you say it's the largest amount
on the DNA, it depends on which soil parameter you're looking at. On the DNA side, it's measured in terabases, and so what I've been fascinated by lately is we have the largest DNA database, not largest soil DNA database, but the largest DNA database in the world, just because there is so much DNA in soil. But what I'm finding doubly fascinating is humans only know what about like 5% of that DNA is, right? We have not mapped the rest of the bacteria and fungi that are sitting in our database. They all come, much of it comes from, recognizable strains and things like that, but we actually haven't mapped out these species. And so I'm just super excited lately about, there's been, just massive investment in these biological AI tools by Google and others, billions of dollars over the last few years. And these tools are getting fantastically capable in terms of like modeling, protein interactions and simulating them in ways that, we couldn't even fathom before. And so I think we're either now or sometime in the next 12 months or so going to be in a position to target, some of these AI tools at this database and say, hey, we want, go identify all the species that are in this database. We want you to go find some, useful candidate strains for new biological products around, nitrogen solubilizing or phosphorus solubilizing, or go find some, candidate strains of mycorrhizal fungi that might be excellent at sequestering carbon, yet, really good at transmitting nutrients to plant roots. And to be honest with you, I'm a biological novice. The last biology class I had was 9th grade biology. So, I'm just learning as fast as I possibly can. But I didn't even know until a year ago that most of the antibiotics people use come from soil fungi.
Right.
Right. Penicillin is a soil fungus, which makes sense. That's where all the fungi in the world live. They come from the soil, right? They don't live in too many other places. So I think it's highly believable there are probably several other new strains of antibiotic fungal material sitting in this database. We just don't know what they are. To be honest with you, only AI has the capability to sort through this much data and kind of applications. I think we're just entering such an incredibly fun time for these kind of data sets.
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely. And just like final question, when you think about challenges right now, when you think about scaling the company, you think about driving growth, what are the main kind of the biggest obstacles and kind of headwinds that you see out there at the moment?
Yeah, there's always a bunch. I see running a technology startup is always, it's always a hand-to-hand combat situation. There's always problems that need to be solved every single day. Trying to grow any kind of company rapidly is really hard. Doing so in probably the climate and agriculture space might be even harder than some of the others. So there's certainly always challenges. Like right now, it's a fairly uncertain time for farmers in the U.S. and around climate with the new administration. So that creates some challenges just around uncertainty, to be honest with you. Helping our stakeholders navigate some of that uncertainty. So that's probably some of the issues lately. But just keeping up with the organization and the market demand growth is in and of itself always a challenge, right? It's one of the things I like to say is for anyone who's working in a startup, you're never allowed to be good at your job very long because if you're growing 2x every single year, you have a different job by definition, every couple of months, right? You're managing twice the revenue or twice the number of people or twice the flow of data, and so it's there. I don't think there's any reprieve from challenges, and we have the same numbers that probably everybody else does.
Yeah, and great stuff. And, well, Lars, listen, I could chat to you all day about this. Fascinating discussion. Really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your own journey and the fascinating journey you've been on, and also just with EarthOptics and your passionate kind of vision and I suppose the journey over the last 5 years with it and some of your thoughts towards this really valuable topic. So thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, Simon, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all our listeners for tuning into this week's show. Hope you enjoyed the conversation and see you next time.